Hi, everyone, and welcome to our Facebook Live. My name is Val, and I work for the Science Media Office team. And today I will be your host for the next 45 minutes. During this time, we will explore a concerning global trend where the international community support for democracy is declining, influencing democratic backsliding worldwide, slipping closer to despotism as democratic ideas fade. So that's why I want to introduce you today to Susan Hyde, and she's joining us from the University of California at Berkeley, and she is an expert as an international election observation, election fraud, international norms, and democracy promotion. And Susan will help us unpack her recent review published in Science and the ideas it presents. So before I pass the mic to Susan, I want to encourage the audience to leave any comments or questions that you have for us so we can ask those during our discussion. So back to you, Susan. Welcome.
Thank you, Val. Thanks for the invitation to be here. I am really happy to be here to talk about this essay. I want to just briefly say what it's about. The angle that I wanted to pursue was a focus on international relations and how changes at the global level in geopolitics, but also in global trends in support or the lack of support for democracy are influencing this trend that's been documented by a lot of other scholars who are focused on comparative politics, which we call democratic backsliding. And democratic backsliding is basically the movement away from democratic institutions in countries that have had them. The movements away from democracy can be very gradual, they can be very subtle, they can be hard to document. They ultimately move a country, though, closer to authoritarianism, and they can include really abrupt shifts to authoritarianism, but one of the things that I want to emphasize is that this is something that can happen to countries that are only partially democratic, and it can also, as we've been seeing, happen to countries that have been functioning democracies for quite some time. So the essay, I use it as an excuse to engage in some discussion of the consequences we think there are likely to be of this global turn away from international support for democracy, which I think has been pressuring leaders around the world to look and act more democratic than they might otherwise have been inclined to be, has provided direct support for citizen movements around the world, and has also engaged in some democracy assistance programs that have helped a lot of countries develop democratic institutions. Many of those things are around, but they've in some ways lessened, and other forms of public support for democracy have also declined, which is something that I think is affecting this broader trend of democratic backsliding in interesting ways.
Yeah, so thank you, Susan. And one of the things that you're saying is that the international support for democracy provides a direct support for citizens. But for example, in the case of Venezuela, where they're trying to call for free and fair elections, and basically in order to do that, they need to create a new institution. But there is a divide in the international community. So how can citizens gain the international community support for democratic movements?
Yeah, it's a really tough problem. One of the things that I mention in this review, and that I've thought a lot about more generally in my work, is that when people are critical of democracy assistance and democracy promotion, I think that they're sometimes comparing it to the world in which international actors wouldn't interfere at all, that they would stay out of the domestic political business of sovereign states throughout the world. Historically, we have seen that that's rarely the case. If countries are not engaged in supporting democratic institutions, they're often engaged in doing other things in that country, some of which are more partisan in nature, may involve foreign election interference, may involve direct support for candidates that they think will pursue policies that are closer to their goals. So you brought up the case of Venezuela. I think it's a really tough situation in a lot of ways. And it highlights in some ways the value of having outside support for democracy that is nonpartisan in nature and that can be focused on developing the democratic institutions. What's not clear is how to get the international community to better support Venezuelan re-democratization, we might call it, and many of the problems that Venezuela is currently experiencing, I think, are exacerbated by the governance issues that are really closely tied to this trend that I'm discussing in the essay of democratic backsliding.
Well, then let's hope that in the meantime, as they raise their voices, the international community continue to hear that conversation. Which brings me to the next point, because now with COVID, I'm concerned that certain governments might use that as an excuse to push certain elections. So could that even happen? Can elections go away, like absolutely completely gone?
This is a trend that's being followed very closely by a number of international actors. I think the organization that is following it most publicly and most clearly is IFES, the International Foundation for Electoral Systems. They've posted a tracker of countries that have chosen to postpone their elections, most of them for reasons related to COVID-19. Some of them have been national elections, and some of them have even been presidential elections. I am concerned that this is a really handy excuse for some types of leaders around the world who may use the excuse, the sort of legitimate public health excuse of COVID-19 and of the global pandemic, to postpone elections for public health reasons, and then not be any great hurry to bring them back. So far, as I show in the essay, we really haven't seen a sharp trend away from countries holding elections. Almost all countries in the world, as I document, are now holding direct elections for national office. Many of them are already pretty fraudulent, but what we haven't yet seen, and what we might see possibly related to this, it is a trend I'm going to be following very closely. Are we going to actually have countries stop holding elections entirely? So far, I don't think that that's happened yet, but I think it's entirely within the range of possibility, and I'll be paying close attention.
Well, let's just hope that that doesn't happen. I agree. I think it's important to really take care of a democratic process. So can you talk a little bit about what is a fraudulent election? What does that entail?
Yeah, there's a point actually related to the prior question that's very much tied to the question of what's a fraudulent election. So I mentioned that most countries in the world are holding elections for national office with direct voting. There's only a small handful of countries that haven't held those elections in the past decade. And what is really important to emphasize when I talk about this trend is that many of those elections are fraudulent. Many of those elections are rigged. Many of those elections are stacked in favor, not just in favor of the incumbent, but set up such that the incumbent cannot lose those elections. And so fraudulent elections can be manipulated well in advance of election day. They can be manipulated on election day. And I also consider it to be election fraud when an incumbent or an election occurs. The result is not what a set of powerful political actors wanted. And so they simply fail to acknowledge the election results or nullify the election results if they're not consistent with what they wanted. Those are all forms of election manipulation. That I could talk about types of election fraud all day. There's many types of election fraud, many ways to rig elections, and historically leaders have been quite creative.
Well, that is actually concerning. Is that why then you were interested to be an international election observation? Do you have to know about all these types in order to do that?
So international election observers, at least those that are from reputable organizations and that are affiliated with those types of missions, have a few different types of expertise. So sometimes they have very deep expertise in the country. Sometimes they're combined with people who have deep expertise about elections around the world, maybe don't have the same level of country expertise. On an individual team, those types of people are often paired up to share their expertise both about the country and the culture and the language, as well as the political history with individuals like me who are sort of generalists about technologies of election administration, election manipulation, and problems that we might see throughout the electoral process.
So is that why you went to Venezuela in 2004 as an observer, since you had that generalist technology background?
Yeah, so at the time I was still a PhD student, so one could say I was still developing my expertise, but I had the opportunity to go and to begin to learn more about that. And I was there for part of with the Carter Center for one of the recall signature re-verification processes that Hugo Chavez initiated in order to try to stay in power even after there was a pretty large citizen movement against him. So, I learned a lot through that process. I think Chavez was one of these leaders who was relatively good at maintaining the plausible deniability that he was not doing something so far out of line that it was really clear that the international community had to come in strong and condemn what he was doing. And in that way, he was sort of very good at manipulating the process to his own advantage, using more subtle forms of election manipulation technology, some of which are not necessarily illegal, but we think as scholars of democracy, things that are not necessarily associated with the ideal type of democratic election that we can imagine.
Yeah, so we have an election process in place, and it seems like the framework is just continues to be outdated. Is it that these frameworks cannot catch up to modern days so that governments that want to go more towards authoritarianism doesn't take advantage of this?
It's very hard to design a process that's completely bomb-proof, right? There's a wide variation in electoral systems. There's wide variation in systems of election administration. We think some of them are a bit more robust than others. Some seem to just be more resilient to challenges, although, as we see more challenges around the world, I suspect we'll learn more about that. One of the things that I think is important to emphasize, though, is that there's really three important things to keep your eye on. One is what the leader is doing. One is what the existing institutions incentivize. And one is what the citizens and the political parties are doing. So those three things I think are really important to continue to pay attention to for any country that you're interested in watching in terms of these trends. And I think Venezuela, I know that you're from Venezuela, and man, it's really a polarized political situation. And when politics are so polarized, it can be very hard for citizens to have faith in the institutions and have faith in the leaders who are occupying those institutions and those positions of power because they have seen their own position and their own ability to exercise their rights be threatened so much. It becomes very hard for citizens to trust the process. And so one of the things that I emphasize in the piece is just that as we see a decline in international support for democracy around the world, one of the open questions is really the degree to which citizen movements in favor of democracy will be able to overcome the authoritarian tendencies of governments that attempt to take their countries further in the direction of authoritarianism.
Yeah, I hope that, the Venezuelan people and any other country that wants to continue these democratic movements can continue to work towards that as the international community continues to listen. I also want to remind the audience that they can leave any questions down below so we can ask Professor Susan Hyde. And I see as well that we have people connecting from Bangladesh, Cameroon, India, Pakistan, and even the US. So thank you so much for joining us. I see that many people are interested in the state of democracy. I have a question here from Dilmas Kilmas, and the question is, would post-COVID-19 elections and countries having hard time in economics and pandemics have any potential to change the context within?
Yeah, so I think what we're seeing right now is a really complex set of what some might call emergencies that governments are dealing with. And the concern is that some more authoritarian governments or some leaders who are interested in making their own institutions more authoritarian or trying to push in that direction will take advantage of these crises to consolidate their hold on power. But there are a couple of countervailing forces, which I think maybe is partly related to this question. One of the countervailing forces is just that when there are economic crises, the government and the parties in power tend to be less popular. And if they're simultaneously moving in an authoritarian direction, that can create some added incentives for citizens to protest against the government, as other scholars have documented in historical cases. The combination with a pandemic is something we haven't seen on this scale before, so there's not a lot of history to go on in terms of how widespread elections currently are and how many countries are having major public health crises associated with the global pandemic, as well as the economic consequences of that.
Yeah.
So, I don't know how it's going to play out is the short answer. But I do think what I would be paying attention to is how governments in power are trying to use this as an excuse to consolidate that power.
Yeah, well, I look forward to your comments later on. I'm going to have to send you an email because I would love to have your insights as this continues to develop. I have another question here from Megan Phelan, and she asks, can you talk a little bit about how long democratic backsliding has been happening in the US? How much of that time have scholars been studying it as it impacts the US?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'll say first that I'm not an expert in American politics. I have a lot of colleagues around the hallway that I'm currently sitting in who focus on American politics, but many of them have not focused on democratic backsliding at all in their career. So suddenly I'm having a lot more conversations with my colleagues in American politics and who focus their research on US politics about this topic. I would say that a number of people have been focused on threats and inequalities in American democracy for a very long time. So there's a lot of ways in which US democracy has been fundamentally flawed, one might say, at least for the experiences of some types of voters. The efforts to disenfranchise often poor, often African American individuals has been really extensive, and that history is long, and I don't want to discount that. There's something else happening now as well, which is that at least for the past several years, there have been growing forces within the Republican Party, especially that seem anti-democratic and that are connected to anti-democracy subcomponents of political parties in other countries around the world. So this is not just, I'm not pointing to the Republican Party specifically. I'm saying that this is something that's happening in a lot of political parties around the world. And it's unique in a lot of ways for, as we've been watching the current US president to be the one who's most directly talking about and trying to initiate threats to democracy. So that's something that I've seen. How long has it been going on? That people have been paying attention to this in the U.S. If you count, the inequalities in U.S. democracy, people have been paying attention to that issue for quite some time. If you're just talking about what's been happening in the past several years, people talk about, for example, packing the courts as a sign of democratic erosion. That's something that happened in Hungary and Poland, for example. And so trying to introduce partisan bias and to erode the impartiality of the judiciary, that's something I think we can trace that trend back.
Gotcha. But part of that question is actually being related now to a second question from Ivan, and he's asking, is the US going to have international elections observance? And if so, how many and how are they going to choose which states to monitor? Yeah, that's a really tricky question. So we have had international observers in the US from the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, the OSCE ODIHR. We've had them here since 2002. And in 2016, we had also a delegation from the Organization of American States. This year, the OSCE ODIHR that the U.S. is obligated to invite did a needs assessment mission. They said that they wanted to send 100 long-term observers and 400 short-term observers, and I've just learned pretty recently that they were unable to recruit those individuals because of the U.S. handling of coronavirus and the response. It, basically, other members of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe were unwilling to send the same numbers of short-term observers that they've been able to send in the past, I think mainly out of concern for their safety. And so what we're having this year in one of the more contentious elections the U.S. has experienced in quite some time is a limited mission with about 30 long-term observers. Under normal circumstances, they would deploy
throughout the country to try to have a combination of coverage of representative snapshot of what's going on, and to cover places that they think might be particularly contentious and that they should be there to try to see what's going on.
And so is it normal that international observants can cover that wide of a large territory, even though there's so few little of them? Is that even reliable?
So I think a lot of people emphasize, the short-term observers that are going around from polling station to polling station on election day. That's mostly what I've done. Is I've been a short-term observer and spent a little bit of time in the head offices in country of election observation missions. And the head office is where honestly a lot of the action is. They're talking with stakeholders throughout the country. They're often monitoring the media. They're meeting with political parties. They're meeting with candidates. And they're following what's happening in a more general sense. Often they're sitting or visiting the election commission and observing the deployment of materials. So there's a ton of things that are maybe even more important that they observe and that they can't observe from with a smaller group of experts and of staff. That I think is not as it's not a great photo opportunity. So I think people tend to see that less. But you're right. For a country as big as the U.S. or Indonesia, where I've also been an election observer, has more territory to cover and more polling stations to cover than the United States does. A few hundred observers. They can uncover things, right? They do find things and they do document things, but to say they've been comprehensive is really difficult. And so what they often do is coordinate their reporting with citizen observer groups, which are often able to deploy very widely in many countries throughout the world. And it's so long as they're reputable and nonpartisan, they can often discuss their shared findings and talk
Right.
about.
So they are at least having those connections and having more resources to do the job, which is much better than doing it themselves. I have here another question from Mateo Santoro. He says, hi from the UK. Hi, Mateo. In Western democracies, the impact of COVID-19 has seen the role of parliamentary chambers put in second place. Executive orders, emergency decree, and bills have been approved without the oversight of the parliamentary bodies around. What type of surveillance mechanisms there are in place to tackle this phenomenon?
Yeah, this is exactly what I have been thinking about in relation to this essay and in relation to the broader trend. So in the not too distant past, an important check on overreach by many governments throughout the world, or the abuse of power, the abuse of institutions, was some degree of concern for their own international reputations. A lot of leaders, I think, were quite concerned with how they were perceived globally, and were watching to make sure that they didn't overstep and they weren't shamed, not just domestically, but also internationally. And this trend that you point to, I don't have any hard data on how frequent that is, but just based on your description and your assertion that this is happening in a number of places, I have also heard anecdotal reports of this happening in a number of places. I think it's reflective of the trend that I mentioned earlier, which is leaders thinking about how to consolidate their hold on power, and using this as an opportunity for their own exercise of power.
Right. I hope that there can be some mechanisms to observe that as scholars, as yourself and others, to report this. I have another question here from Seokia. Can you address the effects of this instance of democratic backsliding on tensions and peace between democratic states?
Yeah, so I'm not sure if this individual, Sequoia, if you're referencing the democratic peace, which is an important finding in international relations about the tendency for democracies not to go to war with one another. So it's an empirical regularity that's been documented historically. This is a strange thing to say to a general audience, and I hope it comes across the right way. But as a scholar, sometimes when bad things happen in the world, it creates an opportunity for us to better understand things that we have long been trying to look for opportunities to dig into. And so we don't really know how democratic backsliding is going to influence that empirical regularity that democracies tend to not go to war with one another. It's possible that as democracy erodes, and as democratic institutions and systems of public checks and accountability become hollowed out, at least for some of the theories that purport to explain the democratic piece, we'd expect that some of those countries would be more likely to go to war with one another. But it hasn't, I don't think that we yet know. But
Right.
I'm sure some of my colleagues are paying attention to that very closely.
Yeah, thank you for that input, Susan. We have a question here from Joseph Karras, and he says, could you expand a bit on what democratic leaders can do to restore the faith in institutions, particularly in regards to misinformation and propaganda campaigns?
So I've been asked a question about what I think is one of the greatest threats to democracy these days. And I think that misinformation and the siloing of public consumption of information, such that partisans of one party get their information from one source, partisans of another party get their information from another source, combined with disinformation and combined with the sort of news feeds and the personalized headlines that many people are getting, I think that this does become a real threat to democracy. And the reason I think this question has actually hit the nail on the head, it is very hard to rebuild trust if there's no way to communicate to voters across the political spectrum. So for a democratic leader who is interested in rebuilding trust in institutions and combating misinformation, they would have to find a way to break through those informational silos and break through the algorithms that are sorting people into like-minded pockets of people, and to encourage them to think about maybe what it means to be a citizen of that country, what their rights are, how what democracy means is really being willing to take time losing, right? Take a turn at sitting out of power on the promise that you'll be able to come back into power someday soon.
So then because these misinformation happening in social media is just through online platforms, would you say that maybe leaders have to look for ways to promote these type of conversations offline, having those person to person or going through different cities to perhaps combat that?
You know, I think the solution is not yet clear to me. I'm not sure that the solution is all about going offline. We're obviously all living most of our work lives online now. It's very hard to get completely away from social media. I do think that there's room for national leaders of many countries around the world to do more to try to teach their citizens how to think about what high quality information is and what it looks like and who they should trust. But that's so corruptible, right? I mean, how do we trust those leaders to do that correctly?
Yeah.
So
exactly that point brings me to another question from Migeni, and hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly, but he says, how has democratic processes been affected and compromised by money? So is this probably another threat to democracy?
Oh gosh. It's very hard to hold elections with zero money, right? Just running an election without any campaigning still costs money. It has to come from somewhere, right? And again, we're talking about elections amongst large numbers of people, as some of the old school theorists of democracy would emphasize. You can do it on the cheap if you don't have that many people, but clearly money in politics is corrupting. And it's not clear exactly what the solution to that might be. So I'll just say, yes, it can corrupt the process. It's been a problem for many countries around the world. There are some things like public financing of campaigns that some people think are useful things to implement to try to help deal with money in politics. But for the most part, the central problem is not just about candidates coming with money to races, but also about political parties who are in power using the apparatus of the state to generate support for their own candidacy, right? A sort of abuse of state resources to try to keep them in power. That's also a very big problem. And even if you have lots of rules against campaign contributions or that kind of thing, you'll still have that potential problem of parties and candidates who are in power having the temptation to try to abuse state resources to stay in.
So definitely not a very straight answer or solution for sure. There's many nuances to it, which brings me now to my next question from Matthew Wright. And he asked, can you comment on the effects that the policies and practices of social media companies have had on democracies around the world?
Oh, that's a little bit out of my depth. I don't want to get myself in trouble. I'm certainly not an expert in the variation in social media company policies around the world. I will say that one of the things I do reference in my piece is that some authoritarian governments are still very much worried about the spread of information. And I don't mean disinformation, I mean accurate information about what they're doing, and have engaged in things like internet filtering and the selective censorship of content, for example, about protests against other governments in the region. And this is something that other scholars have documented. It's a really interesting trend. I will say just very briefly that I think the social media companies could do more to be socially responsible and to do less to undermine democracy in the world.
Well, bringing it back to you actually, to your expertise and the review is that what can citizens of democracies can do to engage with this problem of democratic backsliding?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll say two things very quickly. One is that many people interpret this through a partisan lens. And I think it's important to emphasize that you can support democracy separately from your own political views. This, in many countries, shouldn't be a partisan issue. What citizens can do, I think, is think about how their actions are both interpreted as defending democracy in their country, if that's something they're interested in doing, and something that can be partisan. So there's a range of actions that citizens can take to try to support democracy. I have to say that globally, around the world, sometimes that means accepting loss in an election peacefully. That's what democracy is based on, and everybody does have to take a turn sitting losing an election, and it's unpleasant, right? It's unpleasant for everyone who's ever experienced that, I think, around the world. But it's more unpleasant when you fear that the party in power is going to take away democracy, and this will be your last opportunity to fight for it. So I just encourage the separation of those two things.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying the differences between the two. We have a question from Marco Baum, and he asks, how has political advertisement on the internet with the help of microtargeting influenced elections?
That's an interesting question. So there's a version of it that's very benign, and microtargeting is just more efficient for political campaigns to speak to voters about issues they care about. If I look at that from the perspective of my interest in election manipulation and election fraud, it's very hard to see in microtargeting to see disinformation and who the disinformation might be affecting in real time, such that you can do something to defend against that type of disinformation. So, for example, a common voter suppression tactic, it's not new, but bringing microtargeting into it makes it, I think, more pernicious, which is when people are told that their polling station has moved when it has not, in fact, moved, or that their method of voting that they were planning to use is no longer a method of voting that's allowed. When that information is false, it's called voter suppression, and it can be much harder to document that it's happening, call it out, and do something about it if the micro-targeting makes it harder to sort of see all of the ways in which that disinformation is being sent out to individual citizens.
So then why are all these steps for democracy backsliding happen either gradual or are hard to detect, like you're saying? What are those factors? Is it because there's no real time to document that? Even if the same voters, when they go to the polls, they can record with their phones and see that they're being suppressed or places are being shut down?
Yeah. So it's very tricky, right? There's cases all around the world of disinformation about election manipulation too, right? So sometimes people will try to accuse the other side of manipulation when they feel like they're losing, and they might just be losing, right? This is a very common tactic for losers or candidates who are losing. So some people think that the sort of crowdsourcing of election protection and the ability of citizens to record problems with elections is going to be a big deterrent. I think it's possible that that can help in some cases. I think it's important to note that there's two things going on there. One is that if it's just self-reported, we may be missing some of the most important places in which election manipulation is happening without a systematic effort to document it. And if there's a number of other things going on as well, it could just be hard to know when some of those videos are manipulated, right? We're getting into the world of deep fakes. We're getting into technological innovation in which lots of people can come up with really strange but sometimes effective ways to try to make their political opponents look bad. And sometimes that's by falsifying charges of election manipulation or confusing the irregularities that happen in any election that are not necessarily partisan, trying to sort of cast those as partisan problems.
Yeah, well, I definitely admire the work that the International Election Observance do, because it's definitely tricky. And we are getting closer to the end of our Facebook Live. And I would like to squeeze in one more question, if possible. And his name is Michael Ederman, and he asks, when might the level of non-voters factor into a democracy?
So I am a person who thinks that non-participation, it can be a democratic act for a voter. So some countries have compulsory voting. Then I think it's fine for citizens to spoil their ballots. There's a good way for it's part of democracy for citizens to be able to communicate their dissatisfaction with all of the options, and that's one way to do it. I do think that what we often see is that young people and certain groups within a society choose not to participate because they don't feel as though the process is working for them or something like that. And I do think that, at least from my perspective, political participation across all sectors of society is important. So ranging from young people to old people, but also different demographic groups. That's an important thing for a country to have if it is calling itself a democracy. And so when a lot of people disengage from the process, it gives those who stay more power. And so that in itself is, I think, a really important thing to acknowledge when people are turning away from the process. Of course, there's something called election boycotts, where parties say this process is so bad that our party is refusing to participate. And those can also be very powerful at delegitimizing an electoral process when it's deserved.
So far we've learned what's the role of an international observant for elections is, about democracy processes through electing and even voting or not voting, and as well the different tactics that many governments might use through elections to continue to stay in power. So before we leave this discussion, do you have anything else that you would like to add, Susan, especially how's the feedback has been on your publication, perhaps?
Yeah, I think that it's been just a delight and an honor to engage with people from outside of my own field and outside of political science about this topic. I do think that there's a lot of changes in the international system, including increasing power of Russia and China, the U.S. turning away from what has been a global leadership role that has often been problematic, but has been generally pro-democracy. These things are important global shifts, and they have repercussions in many countries throughout the world. And so I'm not trying to say that one is bad and the other is good. Far from it. I just think that they're consequential changes, and it will be interesting to see how they play out in the coming years.
Well, we look forward to your thoughts as well as all of these things continue to move. I would like to thank everyone for joining us today. My name is Val from the Science Magazine Media Office team, and you can find Susan's latest review in this post. I just clicked down the link and you can see further thoughts on Susan's about the democratic backsliding. So thank you everyone so much again.
Thank you, Val. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Susan.